Hello, everyone. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and click the like button and tell us in the comments which city are you listening from. So let's get started. It was the summer of 2019 when I moved into the house on Maple Drive. The place seemed perfect at first sight. A modest two-story with a decent backyard and a pool that the previous owners had barely used. Nothing in the air of that sweltering July evening suggested that my life would change forever. At that time, I was a software engineer for a mid-sized tech company. I was 32, lived alone after a recent breakup, and my routine consisted of coding, swimming late at night to beat the heat, and ordering takeout while binge-watching Netflix series. I was the type of person who solved problems through logic and analysis, and I never believed in anything that couldn't be debugged or explained through rational thought. I remember the details of those first nights with disturbing clarity. The oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick as soup, the distant hum of air conditioners throughout the neighborhood, the chlorinated scent of pool water mixing with the heavy fragrance of jasmine from next door. There was something in the atmosphere I couldn't identify, a tension almost imperceptible, like waiting for a system crash that never comes. The first sign that something was wrong was the sound of footsteps on gravel late at night. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a neighbor walking their dog or someone taking out trash. But now I realize it was the beginning of everything. If I had known what was coming, I would have fled immediately. But human curiosity is a fatal flaw, and I was about to discover exactly how far it could take me. My routine was absolutely mundane. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone kept to themselves, worked remotely most days from my home office, and maintained normal relationships with my colleagues and a few local acquaintances. Nothing in my life suggested that anything extraordinary could happen. The place where it all began had specific characteristics that I now realize were important. The back fence was just tall enough to obscure a person's body, but not their head. The pool lights cast strange shadows that danced across the water's surface, and the neighbor's house behind mine had been vacant for months, creating a pocket of darkness that seemed to absorb sound. The first anomaly was so small I almost ignored it completely. While swimming late one night, I caught a glimpse of what looked like someone standing perfectly still behind the fence, just at the edge of the pool light's reach. At the time, I attributed it to shadows playing tricks with my tired eyes. In the following nights, small oddities began to accumulate. The same silhouette appeared in roughly the same spot, always during my late-night swims. My motion sensor lights would trigger without apparent cause. I'd find wet footprints on the concrete that weren't mine, despite the ground being dry when I went inside. Each incident individually could be coincidence, but together they began to form something disturbing. I tried to find logical explanations for everything. I thought about stress, lack of sleep, possible intruders casing the neighborhood. I even installed a security camera system, but the footage always seemed to malfunction during the crucial moments, showing nothing but static where the figure should have been. The anomalies began to get more frequent and intense. The silhouette became clearer, tall, unnaturally thin, always perfectly motionless. It would appear for exactly the same duration each night, never moving, never responding when I called out. It was impossible to continue ignoring that something was fundamentally wrong. It was when I saw the figure clearly for the first time, standing at least 7 feet tall, with impossibly long limbs and a face that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, that I felt genuine fear for the first time. It was no longer possible to deny that I was experiencing something unnatural. The decisive moment came when I decided to confront the presence directly. I grabbed a flashlight and walked to the back fence, my heart hammering against my ribs as I approached the spot where it always stood. When I reached the fence and shined the light through the gaps, I found myself staring at a patch of dead grass in the exact shape of human feet, grass that had been green just hours before. What I witnessed defied all senses. The air around that dead patch felt electrically charged, carrying a metallic taste that coated my tongue and throat. The silence was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums like deep water pressure. Even the crickets had gone completely mute. I began to notice changes in my own behavior. Sleep became elusive, and when it did come, it was filled with dreams of standing motionless for hours, watching someone else through their window. At first, they were subtle shifts in my routine, but they rapidly became impossible to ignore.
My way of seeing the world changed radically. Shadows seemed deeper and more substantial, like they contained hidden spaces that my eyes had never noticed before. Reflections in windows and mirrors occasionally showed things that weren't actually behind me. Time flowed strangely during those late hours, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Desperately, I tried to document what was happening. Photos, videos, detailed logs of each encounter, but all evidence behaved strangely, files corrupting themselves or showing completely different content when I reviewed them later. I realized I was completely alone in this experience. When I tried to explain to others, they looked at me with a mixture of concern and fear. My colleagues suggested I take time off. Friends stopped returning calls, and I began to question my own sanity. Gradually, the phenomenon began to spread. Other neighbors started reporting similar sightings. Always the same impossibly tall figure, always perfectly still, always watching. It was as if it were contagious in some way I didn't understand. The first radical transformation I witnessed was my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had lived on the street for 15 years, suddenly becoming completely nocturnal and standing motionless in her yard for hours at a time, staring at other houses with the same unblinking intensity as the original figure. I discovered that the phenomenon spread through sustained observation. The more you watched the watcher, the more it watched you back, until the roles became impossibly blurred. Each new person affected accelerated the process in some way, creating a network of silent sentinels throughout the neighborhood. Interestingly, each person reacted differently. Some, like Mrs. Chen, became stationary observers. Others began walking the streets in the early morning hours, moving from house to house in predetermined patterns. The phenomenon seemed to adapt to the psyche of each individual, finding the perfect expression of their deepest surveillance instincts. In me, the changes deepened. I found myself knowing things about my neighbors that I had never observed directly. Their sleep schedules, their private routines, their fears. I felt compelled to position myself where I could see into multiple houses simultaneously, as if gathering data for some purpose I couldn't yet understand. I began to perceive layers of reality that had previously been invisible. Every house contained secret rhythms, patterns of behavior that formed complex geometric shapes when viewed from the right perspective. It was terrifying and fascinating simultaneously, like seeing the source code of human existence. I developed strange impulses, needs I had never felt before. The compulsion to stand perfectly still for hours became irresistible. My body temperature dropped several degrees, and I no longer felt discomfort from heat or cold. Sleep became unnecessary, replaced by a state of alert stillness that was more restful than any sleep I'd ever experienced. The way I communicated with other affected individuals changed completely. We didn't need words or gestures. Information passed between us through subtle shifts in posture, micro-movements that conveyed complex data about the subjects we were observing. Human language seemed primitive and inadequate for our purposes. The environment around us began to modify itself. Property lines became more defined, shadows fell in more convenient patterns, and reflective surfaces multiplied, appearing in windows and puddles exactly where they were needed for optimal observation angles. The neighborhood seemed to respond to our transformed presence. I tried to fight against the changes, but I realized that resistance only made the process more painful. It was like fighting against evolution itself, against a fundamental improvement in human perception and purpose. Gradually, I began to understand the true nature of what was happening. This wasn't random or malevolent. It was a form of social optimization, a way of creating perfect surveillance networks that could monitor and protect communities more effectively than any technology. It was older and more comprehensive than I had ever imagined, with evidence of similar transformations dating back centuries in various cultures. I realized that this process had been underway much longer than I thought. Historical records of watchers and silent guardians appeared in folklore from around the world, always describing the same tall, motionless figures who maintained eternal vigilance. We were simply the latest iteration of something cyclical, something necessary. The phenomenon had a clear objective, the creation of a perfect information network where every action, every anomaly, every potential threat could be observed and cataloged in real time. It wasn't random or malevolent. It was a form of forced evolution, a compulsory transcendence toward optimal social organization.
As more people were affected, we developed a kind of collective consciousness. Individual thoughts became less important than the shared awareness of everything happening within our observation range. Privacy became an obsolete concept, replaced by the comfort of complete transparency and perfect knowledge. My transformation reached its final stage. I no longer experienced hunger, thirst, or physical discomfort. My body could remain motionless for days without fatigue. My eyes could focus perfectly in complete darkness, and my hearing could distinguish conversations through walls. I was no longer human in the traditional sense, but something new and optimized for my function. The world around us stabilized in a new configuration. Crime rates dropped to zero in affected areas, accidents became impossible due to constant monitoring, and social problems resolved themselves through the subtle interventions of perfectly informed observers. The chaotic randomness of unobserved human behavior was replaced by the elegant order of complete surveillance. I understood that this process would inevitably spread throughout the entire world. Similar networks were already forming in major cities, always starting in suburban neighborhoods where the sight of a motionless figure wouldn't immediately alarm authorities. Humanity as a species was undergoing an irreversible metamorphosis toward perfect social coordination. Today, as I stand here documenting this, I am no longer the person I was when it all began. I maintain enough individual consciousness to record these events, but my primary identity is now as part of the network, a node in an information system that spans continents. How much longer I'll retain this human perspective, I cannot say. If you are reading this,
You need to know that the signs are always the same. The feeling of being watched during private moments, the appearance of tall figures at the edges of your vision, the gradual realization that your neighbor's routines are more synchronized than they should be naturally. The first symptoms are always subtle, but now you know what to look for. I question whether I should have tried to stop this in the beginning, when it might still have been possible, but perhaps it was always inevitable. Perhaps this really is the next step in human evolution, the solution to the chaos and unpredictability that has plagued our species since the beginning. The most terrifying thing isn't what I've become, but the fact that, deep down, I don't regret the transformation. The peace of perfect knowledge, the comfort of never being truly alone, the satisfaction of serving a purpose greater than individual desire. This should frighten me more than any physical change, but it doesn't. Soon, I will no longer be capable of writing human words or having human thoughts. If you find physical evidence of what I've described, do not investigate it further. Do not try to photograph or document it, and especially, do not attempt to understand it completely. The act of sustained observation is itself the first stage of integration into the network.
It was the third week of July when the summer heat became unbearable in my downtown apartment. The concrete jungle trapped every degree, turning my small space into an oven despite the ancient air conditioning unit that wheezed and groaned in the corner. I had moved here 6 months ago for work, a fresh start in a city where I knew no one, and the isolation had become a comfortable companion. Nothing in the oppressive heat of that evening suggested that my carefully constructed solitude was about to become my greatest nightmare. At 26, I was a freelance graphic designer who had embraced the remote lifestyle completely. I lived alone in a ground-floor apartment with sliding glass doors that opened to a small patio overlooking the communal courtyard of my building complex. My routine was predictably mundane: coffee at dawn, work until dusk, takeout dinners while binge-watching series on my laptop. I was the type of person who found comfort in routine and predictability, never believing in anything more supernatural than bad Wi-Fi signals and delayed food deliveries. I remember the details of that sweltering evening with disturbing clarity: the way the humid air clung to my skin like a damp sheet, the distant hum of traffic mixing with the desperate whir of overworked air conditioners, the golden light filtering through my blinds as the sun began its descent. The air itself seemed thick and oppressive, charged with an electricity that made my skin prickle. There was something in the atmosphere that I couldn't identify then, a tension that seemed to press against the walls of my apartment like a living thing waiting to get in. The first sign that something was wrong came at exactly 7:43 p.m. when every light in my building flickered once, twice, then died completely. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than another casualty of the city's overtaxed power grid during the heat wave, a common occurrence that the local news had been warning about for days. The sudden silence that followed was almost peaceful. No more humming electronics, no more artificial cooling, just the natural sounds of evening settling over the city like a suffocating blanket. If I had known what was coming, I would have grabbed my keys and fled to a crowded public place immediately. But human curiosity is a fatal flaw, and I was about to discover exactly how far it could lead me into darkness. The blackout had transformed my familiar apartment into something alien and threatening. And somewhere in that transformed landscape, something was waiting for me to notice it watching from the shadows. My routine had been absolutely ordinary up until that moment. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment with large windows and sliding glass doors that I'd chosen specifically for the natural light they provided during my work hours.
My days were filled with client projects, video calls, and the comfortable solitude of someone who had learned to enjoy her own company. Nothing in my carefully organized life suggested that something extraordinary could shatter it all in a single evening of suffocating darkness. The apartment complex where everything began had characteristics that I now realize were crucial to what followed. The ground floor units opened directly onto a shared courtyard space. The sliding glass doors were the primary source of light and air circulation, and the layout provided multiple angles of visibility from the outside, looking in. The courtyard itself was poorly lit even on normal evenings, with tall hedges and mature trees that created pockets of deep shadow where anything could hide undetected. The building's design prioritized aesthetic charm over security, with decorative lattice work and low fencing that offered more visual appeal than actual protection. The first anomaly was so subtle that I almost dismissed it entirely when I stepped onto my patio to get some relief from the stifling heat inside. As I stood there fanning myself with a magazine, I noticed what appeared to be a person-shaped shadow among the trees on the far side of the courtyard, perfectly still and unnaturally rigid. At the time, I attributed it to my eyes adjusting to the darkness and the way shadows played tricks in the absence of artificial lighting, perhaps a maintenance ladder or piece of equipment left behind by the building's groundskeeping crew. In the minutes that followed, small, unsettling details began to accumulate in ways that formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. The shadow remained in exactly the same position, despite the slight breeze moving the tree branches around it. The usual evening sounds of neighbors seemed muffled and distant, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to find logical explanations for everything I was experiencing as I retreated back inside and closed the sliding door behind me. Perhaps the heat was affecting my judgment, or the stress of the recent move was manifesting in paranoid thoughts about my new environment. I even considered that low blood sugar might be making me lightheaded and prone to seeing things that weren't there. But even as I ran through these rational possibilities, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow in the courtyard was not only real, but actively aware of my presence.
The strange occurrences began to escalate in both frequency and intensity as the evening progressed and the blackout continued. The shadow moved to different positions around the courtyard with a deliberate slowness that suggested careful observation rather than casual movement, always maintaining that unnatural stillness whenever I looked directly at it. I found myself checking the locks on my doors repeatedly and closing blinds that I normally kept open, responding to instincts I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. It was when I saw the shadow standing directly outside my patio doors, close enough that I could make out the outline of a human figure pressed against the glass, that I felt genuine fear for the first time. This was no trick of light or shadow, no product of an overheated imagination. There was someone in my courtyard, someone who had been watching me for an unknown amount of time. The figure stood with unnatural stillness, and in the dim moonlight filtering through the clouds, I could see the pale outline of a hand pressed flat against the glass surface of my sliding door. The moment that shattered my reality completely came when I realized that the figure outside was systematically testing different points of access to my apartment. I watched in paralyzed terror as it moved along the perimeter of my patio, checking the security of windows, examining the locks on doors, and running its hands along the frame of my sliding glass door with the methodical thoroughness of someone conducting a professional security assessment. The deliberate nature of these actions made it clear that this was not random or opportunistic. This person had chosen me, had studied my apartment, and was now exploiting the cover of darkness to probe for weaknesses. What I witnessed challenged every assumption I had about safety and security in my own home. The figure moved with an unnatural fluidity, seeming to know exactly where to apply pressure to test the give of window frames and door locks without making noise that might alert neighbors. In the oppressive heat and darkness, its movements took on an otherworldly quality that made me question whether I was seeing something entirely human. The way it seemed to blend with shadows and emerge from them at will created the disturbing impression that it was as much a part of the darkness as separate from it. I began to notice changes in my own body as the terror took hold. My hands shook uncontrollably, my breathing became shallow and rapid, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin despite the stifling heat of the apartment. The adrenaline flooding my system created a hyper-aware state where every sound seemed amplified and every shadow appeared to move with potential threat. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I worried it might be audible to the figure outside, betraying my location as I crouched behind my couch. My perception of familiar spaces became completely altered as fear transformed my comfortable apartment into a trap. Every piece of furniture became a potential hiding spot or obstacle, every window a point of vulnerability, every sound a possible sign of intrusion. The darkness that had initially seemed like a minor inconvenience now felt like a living entity working against me, providing cover for threats while leaving me blind and vulnerable. Time seemed to stretch and distort, making minutes feel like hours as I waited in terrified silence. I desperately tried to document what was happening by taking photos with my phone, but the camera flash seemed blindingly bright in the darkness, and I feared it would draw unwanted attention to my position. The few images I managed to capture showed only indistant shapes and shadows that could have been anything, providing no useful evidence of the methodical stalking I was witnessing. My hands were shaking so badly that most shots were blurred beyond recognition, and the phone's battery was draining quickly without access to a charger. The realization that I was completely alone with this threat was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire experience. My neighbors' apartments remained dark and silent, suggesting they had either evacuated to cooler locations or were simply unaware of what was happening in the courtyard outside their windows. When I tried to call 911, the cellular towers seemed overwhelmed by the blackout-related emergency calls, resulting in busy signals and dropped connections that left me feeling even more isolated and helpless. Gradually, I began to understand that this was not a random occurrence, but something that had been planned and prepared for specifically. The figure outside seemed to know exactly when to move and when to remain still, how to avoid being seen by other residents, and which apartments offered the best opportunities for whatever it intended to do. The timing with the blackout could not have been coincidental. This person had been waiting for exactly these conditions to implement whatever plan they had been developing.
The first major escalation in the threat occurred when the figure began attempting to force entry through my sliding glass door, applying steady pressure that made the frame creak ominously in the silence. I could hear the soft scraping of tools against metal as it worked to manipulate the lock mechanism, each sound sending waves of panic through my paralyzed body. The methodical nature of these attempts made it clear that this person had both the tools and the expertise necessary to gain entry, and that it was only a matter of time before they succeeded. I discovered that the stalking behavior followed a specific pattern designed to create maximum psychological pressure while minimizing the risk of detection. The figure would approach my doors and windows in phases, spending several minutes at each point testing security measures before retreating into the shadows to observe my reactions. This calculated approach suggested someone with experience in psychological manipulation, someone who understood that the anticipation of violence could be as damaging as violence itself.
My behavior began to change in response to the sustained threat, developing survival instincts I had never needed before. I found myself moving only during the moments when the figure retreated into deeper shadows, timing my movements to avoid detection while trying to reach more secure areas of my apartment. Every decision became a calculation of risk versus necessity, and I discovered reserves of patience and stillness I didn't know I possessed as I waited for opportunities to improve my position. The way I perceived time and space became fundamentally altered during those hours of terror. Minutes stretched into eternities when the figure was directly outside my windows, while the brief moments of respite, when it retreated, seemed to flash by in seconds. The familiar geography of my apartment became a tactical landscape where I measured distances in terms of exposure time and calculated sight lines like a military strategist planning for survival. My attempts to communicate with the outside world became increasingly desperate as traditional methods failed. Text messages wouldn't send due to network congestion. Social media apps couldn't connect to servers, and even my building's emergency intercom system was non-functional without electricity. The isolation was complete and intentional, as if the blackout had been designed specifically to cut off all possible avenues for help while providing perfect cover for whatever was happening in my courtyard. The most disturbing realization was that my reactions to the threat seemed to be part of what the figure was studying. When I moved to different rooms, it repositioned itself to maintain visual contact. When I attempted to use my phone, it seemed to intensify its probing of entry points, as if my desperation was somehow feeding its confidence. This suggested a level of psychological sophistication that transformed the encounter from simple breaking and entering into something far more sinister and personal. The compulsive behaviors I developed during those hours included checking and rechecking locks, counting the minutes between the figure's movements, and mentally rehearsing escape routes that I knew were probably impossible to execute. These repetitive actions provided the illusion of control in a situation where I had none, but they also served to heighten my awareness of every detail of my environment and the threat it contained. The hypervigilance became both a survival tool and a form of psychological torture. I began to understand that resistance or attempts to scare off the intruder would likely escalate the situation in dangerous ways. The figure's calm, methodical approach suggested someone who was prepared for various contingencies and who might respond to direct confrontation with immediate violence. My best chance of survival lay in remaining hidden and undetected while hoping that dawn or the restoration of power would force the stalker to abandon whatever plan they were implementing. Gradually, I started to comprehend the true scope of what I was experiencing as pieces of a larger pattern began to emerge. This was not an opportunistic crime, taking advantage of a power outage, but a carefully orchestrated psychological assault designed to exploit the vulnerability created by isolation and darkness. The figure outside had likely been observing my routines for days or weeks, learning my habits and planning this encounter for maximum impact. The realization that I had been unknowingly under surveillance for an extended period added a new dimension of violation to an already traumatic experience. I began to understand that this methodical stalking had been building towards something specific, though what that endpoint might be remained terrifyingly unclear. The figure's behavior suggested someone working through a predetermined sequence of actions, each phase designed to gather information or test responses before moving to the next level of intrusion. The patience and systematic approach indicated either extensive experience or detailed planning, both possibilities that made my situation exponentially more dangerous.
The true nature of what was happening became clear when I realized that the blackout itself might have been artificially created rather than naturally occurring. The timing was too perfect, the isolation too complete, and the figure's preparedness too thorough for this to be a crime of opportunity. Someone had been planning this encounter for a significant period, studying not just my apartment, but my neighborhood, my building's security systems, and the city's power grid vulnerabilities. As the hours passed and my terror reached new depths, I began to develop an almost supernatural awareness of the threat outside. I could sense the figure's presence even when it was hidden in shadows, feel the weight of its attention when it focused on my location, and anticipate its movements with an accuracy that surprised and disturbed me. This heightened perception felt less like a survival advantage and more like evidence that prolonged terror was fundamentally changing how my mind processed reality. My transformation under extreme stress revealed capabilities I had never needed to access before, but also highlighted the psychological cost of sustained fear. I found myself thinking with a clarity and focus that was razor-sharp in some areas, while completely fragmented in others, able to track minute details of the stalker's behavior while simultaneously losing touch with basic aspects of my own identity and normal thought patterns. The experience was reshaping my understanding of what I was capable of both mentally and physically when survival was at stake. The environment around me seemed to respond to the presence of the threat in ways that defied logical explanation. Shadows appeared deeper and more concealing when the figure needed cover, while areas I desperately wanted to remain hidden somehow seemed more exposed and vulnerable. The physical space of my apartment felt as if it was actively working against me, with creaking floors announcing my movements and reflecting surfaces betraying my position no matter how carefully I tried to move. Finally, I understood that this process was designed to be transformative rather than simply destructive, intended to create lasting psychological changes that would persist long after the immediate threat had passed. The stalker wasn't just probing my apartment's security. They were systematically dismantling my sense of safety and privacy in ways that could never be fully restored. Every future evening alone, every unexpected sound, every moment of solitude would now carry the echo of this violation. Today, as I write this account 3 weeks after that terrible night, I am no longer the same person who confidently moved into a ground-floor apartment because she liked the natural light. The police eventually arrived after a neighbor finally got through on a working landline, but they found only the clear outline of a handprint on my sliding glass door and disturbed soil in the courtyard where someone had obviously spent hours moving between observation points. I maintained enough coherence to provide a detailed statement, but I wonder how much longer I can maintain the pretense of normal functioning. If you are reading this, you need to know that blackouts in urban areas create opportunities that certain predators watch for and plan around. The first sign is often a sense of being observed that seems to intensify when you're alone and vulnerable, followed by evidence that someone has been learning your routines and testing your security measures. Power outages that seem oddly timed or localized should be treated with extreme suspicion, especially if you live alone in an easily accessible residence. I question whether I should have recognized the signs earlier when the figure was still maintaining distance and hadn't yet begun the systematic probing of my defenses. But perhaps this type of calculated psychological assault is designed to be unrecognizable until it's too late to escape, relying on the victim's natural tendency to rationalize unusual occurrences rather than trust their instinctive fear responses. The predator's patience and planning suggest this was always meant to be inescapable once it began. The most terrifying realization
is not what I experienced during those hours of darkness, but the fact that part of me has become hyper-vigilant in ways that feel almost addictive. I find myself checking and rechecking security measures obsessively, studying other residents of my building for signs of suspicious behavior, and feeling most comfortable only when I can monitor all possible approaches to my living space. The experience has created a state of alertness that is both exhausting and strangely reassuring. Soon, I know I will have to make a choice between accepting that I will never feel truly safe again, or making changes so radical that they amount to letting the stalker destroy the life I had built. Every handprint on glass, every shadow that seems to linger too long, every unexpected sound in the darkness now carries the potential to trigger the complete terror I experienced that night. If you find evidence of someone systematically testing your security during power outages, don't investigate it yourself. Don't try to rationalize it away. And most importantly, don't assume that one night of terror means the threat has passed. Some predators are patient enough to wait months or years between encounters, and the knowledge that they've successfully violated your sense of safety once means they understand exactly how to do it again.
It was a Tuesday afternoon in November when the doorbell rang at my suburban home on Elm Street. The house had been my sanctuary for 3 years, a modest 2-story with cream-colored siding and a small front porch where I'd installed security cameras after a string of package thefts in the neighborhood. Nothing in the crisp autumn air of that particular day suggested that my carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered forever. The leaves had turned their familiar amber and rust, and the street maintained its usual weekday quietude. At 34, I worked as a freelance software developer, spending most days in my home office surrounded by multiple monitors and empty coffee cups. I lived alone by choice after a messy divorce 2 years prior, finding comfort in predictable routines and minimal human interaction. My social circle had dwindled to online gaming buddies and the occasional grocery store clerk, and I preferred it that way. I was the type of person who ordered everything online to avoid unnecessary conversations, never believed in conspiracy theories, and maintained a rational explanation for every unexplained occurrence. I remember the details of that afternoon with disturbing clarity. The way the November light slanted through my living room windows, casting long rectangular shadows across the hardwood floor. The house smelled faintly of the vanilla candle I'd lit while working, mixed with the lingering aroma of reheated pizza from lunch. There was a stillness in the air that I now recognize as unnatural, too quiet for a weekday afternoon, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Even my neighbor's perpetually barking dog was silent. The first sign that something was wrong when I checked the doorbell camera feed on my phone. A man in a generic brown uniform stood on my porch holding a medium-sized package and consulting what appeared to be a delivery tablet. At the time, it seemed like just another routine delivery error. Packages often got misdelivered in our neighborhood due to similar house numbers. The man looked ordinary enough. Average height, baseball cap pulled low, regulation delivery company polo shirt that could have belonged to any of a dozen shipping services. If I had known what was truly beginning, I would have never answered the door. But human curiosity is a fatal flaw, and I was about to discover exactly how far down a rabbit hole it could drag me.
The simple act of walking to my front door would set in motion a chain of events that would transform my quiet suburban existence into a waking nightmare of surveillance and psychological torment. My routine had been absolutely ordinary up until that moment. I lived in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's schedules. The Martinez family leaving for soccer practice at 4, Mrs. Chen walking her ancient poodle at sunset, the college student next door playing music too loud on weekends. I worked from home developing mobile applications for small businesses, maintained cordial but distant relationships with my neighbors, and my biggest excitement was usually deciding between Thai or Chinese takeout for dinner. Nothing in my mundane existence suggested that I could become the target of something so elaborate and terrifying. The house where everything began had characteristics that I now realize were important. Large windows facing the street that made interior observation easy. A corner lot that provided multiple approach angles and enough distance from neighboring houses to muffle sounds. My home office was positioned at the front of the house with a clear view of the street, which I had initially considered an advantage for monitoring deliveries and package thieves. The mature oak trees that I'd loved for their shade now seemed like perfect hiding spots, and the quiet cul-de-sac that had attracted me for its peace now felt isolated and vulnerable. When I opened the door, the delivery man's smile seemed practiced, but somehow wrong. Too wide, held too long, as if he was performing the role of a friendly courier rather than actually being one. He held out a digital tablet and insisted that I needed to sign for a package addressed to my house number, but with a name I didn't recognize. The package itself was nondescript, wrapped in standard brown paper with a shipping label that looked legitimate at first glance. His eyes, however, never quite met mine directly, instead seeming to catalog details about my appearance, my home's interior visible behind me, and my general demeanor. In the days that followed, small oddities began to accumulate like autumn leaves blown against my front door. I noticed the same unmarked white sedan parked across the street at different times of day, always occupied by a single figure who seemed to be reading something or talking on a phone. My garbage cans, which I always positioned carefully at the curb on collection day, would be slightly moved or turned at different angles when I retrieved them. The motion sensor lights in my backyard began triggering irregular intervals throughout the night, yet my security cameras never captured anything more substantial than shadows moving just outside their range.
I tried to find logical explanations for everything that was happening. Perhaps the car belonged to someone visiting a neighbor, or maybe a new resident conducting insurance inspections or real estate evaluations. The garbage cans could have been moved by the collection crew or blown by wind, and the motion sensors might have been triggered by cats, raccoons, or other urban wildlife. I even researched common security camera blind spots and motion detector malfunctions online, finding comfort in technical explanations and user forums discussing similar false alarms. The anomalies began to escalate in frequency and specificity, forming patterns that became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Phone calls would come at precisely the same time each evening, 7:47 p.m., with nothing but silence on the other end before the caller hung up after exactly 30 seconds. My internet connection would slow to a crawl during specific hours, making it difficult to work effectively or research what might be happening to me. Food deliveries I'd never ordered would arrive at my door, always paid for in advance, with delivery drivers who insisted they had the correct address and seemed genuinely confused when I refused to accept the packages.
It was impossible to continue ignoring that something was fundamentally wrong with my situation. The coincidences had multiplied beyond any reasonable statistical probability, and the feeling of being watched had become a constant weight on my shoulders. When I tried to discuss my concerns with my few remaining acquaintances, they offered the standard reassurances about urban paranoia and suggested I might be working too much or drinking too much coffee. Their dismissive responses only reinforced my growing sense that I was completely alone in whatever was happening to me, and that isolation became another tool in my tormentor's psychological arsenal. The first time I felt genuine terror was when I discovered the second figure during that initial delivery attempt. While reviewing the security footage more carefully that evening, I noticed movement at the edge of the camera's range. A second person crouched beside what appeared to be the delivery truck, partially obscured by my neighbor's parked car. This person remained hidden throughout the entire interaction, only visible for brief moments when shifting position, as if coordinating the approach or serving as a lookout. The realization that the delivery had been a coordinated effort involving multiple people transformed what I'd initially dismissed as a simple scam into something far more sinister and organized. The decisive moment came when I witnessed them conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance of my daily routine. Through my office window, I observed the same white sedan parked at different locations around the neighborhood over several days, always positioned to have a clear view of my house. The occupant would sit for hours with what looked like binoculars or a camera with a telephoto lens, documenting my movements, noting when lights went on and off, and tracking my brief excursions to the mailbox or garbage bins. The systematic nature of their surveillance made it clear that this was neither random nor amateur. Someone was building a comprehensive profile of my habits and vulnerabilities. What I was witnessing defied all reasonable expectations of normal human behavior or simple criminal opportunism. The level of organization, patience, and resources being devoted to monitoring my unremarkable life suggested something far more complex than a typical burglary or identity theft scheme. The watchers demonstrated an almost supernatural patience, sometimes maintaining surveillance posts for 6 or 8 hours without any apparent movement or activity. Their dedication to the task was both impressive and terrifying, suggesting that whatever their ultimate goal, they were willing to invest significant time and effort to achieve it.
Desperately, I attempted to document everything that was happening, taking photographs of suspicious vehicles, noting license plate numbers, and maintaining detailed logs of unusual incidents. However, the evidence I collected seemed to have a disturbing tendency to become ambiguous or meaningless when viewed later. Photographs would be blurry or show empty spaces where I was certain cars had been parked. License plate numbers would correspond to vehicles reported stolen months earlier, and my detailed notes would reveal patterns that seemed almost too perfect, as if they had been designed to make me appear paranoid or delusional. I realized that I was completely isolated in this experience, unable to convince others of the reality and sophistication of what was happening to me. When I tried to explain the situation to a police officer during a routine patrol, he listened politely but clearly viewed my concerns as the product of urban anxiety or possible mental health issues. Friends and family members, when I could bring myself to contact them, offered well-meaning advice about installing better security systems or suggested that I might benefit from talking to a counselor about stress management, completely missing the calculated nature of the harassment I was experiencing. Gradually, I understood that the phenomenon was expanding beyond simple surveillance into active psychological manipulation designed to isolate me further and increase my sense of vulnerability. My mail delivery became irregular, with important correspondence occasionally going missing, while junk mail and promotional materials continued to arrive normally. My internet searches related to stalking, harassment, or surveillance seemed to trigger immediate responses. Within hours of researching countermeasures online, I would notice increased activity from my watchers, as if they were monitoring my digital activities as well as my physical movements. The harassment evolved to include more subtle forms of property interference that would be difficult to prove or report to authorities. Landscaping elements in my yard would be slightly rearranged. Garden stones moved a few inches, plant stakes adjusted, or outdoor decorations repositioned in ways that were noticeable to me but would seem trivial to others. These changes served as clear messages that my property was being accessed regularly, but they were too minor to constitute obvious vandalism or trespassing that would prompt serious police investigation. I discovered that resistance or attempts to document the harassment only seemed to escalate the situation, as if my watchers were responding to my countermeasures with increased creativity and persistence. Installing additional security cameras prompted them to adjust their positions and timing, while changing my daily routines led to more invasive forms of surveillance that demonstrated their ability to adapt quickly to new patterns. The psychological impact was deliberate and calculated. Every defensive measure I took was met with proof that their capabilities exceeded my ability to protect myself. In attempting to research similar cases online, I found disturbing evidence that this type of systematic harassment was more common than most people realized. Forums dedicated to stalking victims contained accounts that mirrored my experience with frightening precision. The same progression from simple surveillance to complex psychological operations, the same inability to convince authorities of the seriousness of the threat, and the same gradual erosion of the victim's sense of safety and normal social connections. The stories I read suggested that this might be the work of organized groups rather than individual stalkers, possibly connected to criminal organizations, private investigators, or even government agencies. The most disturbing realization was that my situation was likely to continue indefinitely, with no clear resolution or endpoint visible. My watchers had demonstrated remarkable patience and resources, suggesting that they were prepared to maintain their campaign for months or possibly years. The psychological wear of constant vigilance was clearly part of their strategy, designed to exhaust my mental and emotional reserves until I became unable to maintain effective countermeasures or would be driven to make desperate decisions that could be used to discredit my credibility further. Understanding the true scope and sophistication of what was happening filled me with a profound sense of helplessness that was clearly part of the intended effect. This was not the work of amateurs or opportunistic criminals, but rather a coordinated campaign that demonstrated extensive knowledge of psychological manipulation techniques, surveillance technology, and legal loopholes that made effective law enforcement response difficult. The initial delivery attempt had been merely the opening move in what appeared to be a long-term chess game where I was always several moves behind. I began to perceive layers of the operation that had been invisible initially, recognizing that the obvious surveillance was likely just the tip of an iceberg designed to keep my attention focused on threats I could see, while more subtle manipulations occurred in areas I wasn't monitoring. Financial accounts, employment opportunities, social relationships, and even medical records might all be subject to interference designed to gradually isolate me and reduce my ability to seek help or maintain independence. The delivery man's visit had been a psychological probe to assess my responses and vulnerabilities, providing data that would be used to customize the campaign specifically to my personality and circumstances. My communication with others had become compromised in ways that were difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. Emails would arrive delayed or not at all.
Phone calls would drop at crucial moments, and text messages would sometimes be received out of order or with subtle alterations that changed their meaning. Social media accounts showed signs of unauthorized access, with privacy settings mysteriously changed and posts sometimes deleted or modified. These digital manipulations served to further isolate me from potential sources of support, while providing my tormentors with detailed information about my social connections and communication patterns. The physical modifications to my environment had escalated to include more invasive alterations that demonstrated their ability to access my property at will. Personal items would be moved within my house, books placed on different shelves, coffee mugs positioned in unusual locations, or clothing items found in rooms where I hadn't worn them. These changes were subtle enough that I initially doubted my own memory, but the pattern became undeniable as the frequency increased and the alterations became more specific and personal. I developed compulsive behaviors in response to the constant threat, checking locks multiple times, repeatedly reviewing security camera footage, and maintaining detailed logs of every unusual incident. These responses, while providing temporary psychological relief, also served my tormentors' goals by consuming enormous amounts of my time and mental energy, while creating behaviors that appeared obsessive or paranoid to outside observers. The very act of protecting myself was being weaponized against me, creating a psychological trap where reasonable precautions could be interpreted as evidence of mental instability. The harassment had evolved to include manipulation of my professional life, with work projects experiencing technical difficulties, client communications becoming unreliable, and professional opportunities mysteriously evaporating after initial promising contacts. My income began to suffer as the stress affected my ability to concentrate and complete projects effectively, while the constant need to monitor security systems and document incidents consumed time that should have been devoted to work. This economic pressure was clearly intended to increase my vulnerability and limit my options for relocating or seeking professional help. Gradually, I came to understand that the campaign against me was part of a larger pattern of organized harassment that might be connected to broader criminal enterprises, private investigation firms, or even experimental psychological research programs. The sophistication and resources involved suggested backing by well-funded organizations rather than individual stalkers, and the systematic nature of the approach indicated extensive experience with similar operations. My selection as a target might have been random or based on factors I wasn't aware of, but the execution was clearly professional and coordinated.
The scope of the surveillance had expanded beyond my home to include monitoring of my movements throughout the community, with watchers positioned at grocery stores, libraries, restaurants, and other locations where I conducted routine business. This network of observation points required significant manpower and coordination, suggesting that multiple individuals were dedicated to tracking my activities throughout each day. The psychological impact of realizing that nowhere was safe from observation was devastating and clearly intentional. I discovered that attempts to vary my routines or take countermeasures only provided my tormentors with additional information about my thought processes and defensive capabilities. Every strategy I employed was met with adapted tactics that demonstrated their ability to stay ahead of my protective measures. This created a feedback loop where my efforts to regain control actually provided them with more detailed intelligence about my personality, resources, and limitations, making future harassment even more precisely targeted and effective.
The most terrifying aspect was not what they were currently doing to me, but rather the gradual realization that this level of harassment could continue indefinitely, possibly escalating into more serious forms of interference with my life. The psychological warfare was clearly designed to break down my resistance over time, making me more susceptible to whatever their ultimate objectives might be. Whether they sought to drive me to mental breakdown, force me to relocate, recruit me for some purpose, or simply use me as a test subject for harassment techniques, I remained completely ignorant of their true goals. Today, as I write this account, I am no longer the confident, independent person I was when the delivery man first rang my doorbell. The constant stress has fundamentally altered my personality, making me suspicious, hypervigilant, and socially withdrawn in ways that would have been unimaginable just months ago. I maintain enough clarity to document what has happened, but I wonder how much longer I can sustain this level of psychological pressure before my judgment becomes completely compromised. If you are reading this, you need to understand that this type of systematic harassment is real, sophisticated, and more common than most people realize. The warning signs include unexpected deliveries with requests for signatures, repeated appearances of the same vehicles in your neighborhood, technical problems with communications and internet services, and gradual isolation from your normal social and professional networks. The perpetrators are patient, well-resourced, and prepared to invest months or years in achieving their objectives. I question whether I should have taken more aggressive action in the beginning when the harassment was still relatively minor and might have been easier to disrupt. However, I suspect that escalation was always part of their plan, and that any reasonable response would have been incorporated into their psychological profile of me and used to refine their tactics. The system is designed to be self-reinforcing, where both passive acceptance and active resistance serve their purposes in different ways. The most disturbing realization is that I have begun to adapt to this new reality in ways that should concern me more than they do. The constant vigilance has become routine. The social isolation feels normal, and the assumption that I am being watched has become integrated into my decision-making process. This psychological adaptation is probably exactly what my tormentors intended, not to drive me to complete breakdown, but to transform me into someone who accepts surveillance and control as normal aspects of daily life. Soon, I may no longer be capable of maintaining this record or thinking clearly enough to warn others about what can happen to an ordinary person living an unremarkable life in a quiet suburban neighborhood. If you discover physical evidence of systematic harassment similar to what I have described, do not investigate it alone. Do not assume it will stop on its own. And most importantly, do not underestimate the patience and sophistication of those who have chosen you as their next subject. The delivery man's visit was just the beginning.